to give Rabbi Creditor as much time as we can. So welcome everyone. Glad to have you with us this morning. Rabbi Gary Creditor is with us for the next 2 weeks, and he's going to be leading us in a discussion on post-biblical Jewish literature and the creation of Judaism. If you'll recall, you have received this handout from me several times via email this week and in the mail. So if you have it handy, it would help facilitate in our discussion today, as he will be referencing it during our chat this morning. Just have a few quick announcements. Remember that the drive-through Advent gathering is on December 6th from 1 to 3 p.m. And you should have received, if you haven't already by now, the FPC Seasons booklet in the mail. So we have received, or Kathy and I received ours. So hopefully you've received yours as well. And also, if you haven't sent your pledge in yet, please remember to do so. Once again, if you have questions during our chat this morning, please just raise your hand or type it into the chat window and we'll recognize you. We'll be pausing periodically as we go. Please keep those in the military and those with special concerns in your thoughts and prayers. And let's see, with that, I don't have any other announcements. So most of you are familiar with Rabbi Creditor, but for those of you who aren't, I'm going to turn it over to Mary D to give Gary a brief introduction. And then we'll, Rabbi Creditor, sorry about that. And then Rabbi, then we'll turn it over to you after Mary D introduces you. Thank you.
So we've had some new members of the class, and I don't remember who among the regular members were with us when Rabbi Creditor taught us a couple of years ago. The planning group, when we met a few years ago, thought that the class might be interested in rounding out our Christian education with some perspectives from the Judeo side of our Judeo-Christian faith origins. We tried to get him into our curriculum again last year, but our schedules just didn't line up. But this year, we were able to snag him again for 2 classes. Some of you are already familiar with his credentials, but for those of you who weren't with us for his classes a couple of years ago, Rabbi Creditor is Rabbi Emeritus at Temple Bethel here in Richmond, where he retired in 2014 after 21 years of service. He does continue to teach Talmud classes during the week. He's a very active member of the faith community in Richmond and has participated on many boards and communal agencies, some Jewish, some interfaith, and some civic. He was originally ordained by the Jewish Theological Seminary of America in New York City, where he also received a doctorate. And Rabbi Creditor is also a published author. And although he didn't tell me about this, I ran across it online all by myself. Just last week on his father's birthday, he announced the publication of a new book he has written that includes a curated selection of his father's writings focused on a Jewish vision for America. This is not his advertisement, but mine. The book is entitled, Will We Be Worthy? Reflections of an American Rabbi. We're very happy to have him back with us today. And now, Rabbi Creditor, I turn it over to you.
Well, Mary D, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be with all of you. I want to see if I can see the screen. I'm just looking at myself at the moment. Let me just see if I can do some of that. Okay, that's the best it'll go. Yes, my son surprised me for my birthday and published this book of a selection of my sermons over 40 years. And I started to read them and I said, oh, did I write that? But be that as it may. Before we begin, I want to thank you, Mary D, for reaching out and for the leadership of First Presbyterian of this group, the Covenant class, and all those who are making this Zoom class possible. I also want to just begin by holding in our thoughts and prayers all those afflicted with COVID, their families that are supporting them, and to hold certainly the memories of those who passed away, and pray that this pandemic will come to a speediest conclusion possible, and that will return to health for us and everybody around the globe. In my conversation with Mary D. in terms of subject matter, I dropped this little tidbit saying, most of Judaism, it's like an iceberg. What most people know about Judaism is Old Testament. Old Testament, and that's above the waterline, but most of Judaism is what you don't see, unless you're inside the faith perhaps, which is really a tremendous amount below the waterline, my metaphor. And so I sent, with Mary D's help and the staff, sent out this roadmap, which I'm going to begin using as my conversation point. I think most people outside of the Jewish tradition, Jewish faith, know the Old Testament. And whatever you read in it, that's what you see is Jews, Judaism, etc. But the point of the matter is that we don't practice Old Testament religion in terms of what we do. Judaism, if you look at the Old Testament, look in Leviticus and other places, and what will you find? You will find priests, you will find sacrifices, and you will find it done in the tabernacle, that's in the 5 books, or later on in the temple built by Solomon, built a second one rebuilt. What they did there was, excuse me one second. What do you need me to do? Okay. My wife needs my help. Hang on one second. Cut it with a scissor or something. Sorry. But that's not what, if you come to a synagogue today, what are you going to see? You're going to see rabbis. You're going to see a sanctuary. You're going to see an ark with the Torah. But you're not going to see an altar, 2 altars, one for sacrificing animals and bringing grain and bringing libations, and you're not going to find an incense altar. You're not going to see any of that, right? So how did we get from one to the other? And so let me begin at the very beginning of this roadmap that I presented to you. For Judaism, in terms of a text religion, it's going to be the Torah. And that, in terms of its starting point, is going to be said at Mount Sinai. God's revelation to Moses and the Israelite people there. And that will become a document. To go through the canonization of the document I'm not doing, but that will become the central document, namely the Torah, also known as the 5 books of Moses. That document, right, is what's going to be called the written Torah. That's on the right-hand side of this page. And yes, there's more to the Bible. I'll look at that in the second page in a second. But that is going to be the foundation stone in one of the 2 branches of Jewish religious literature. And that Torah, those 5 books of Moses, which in the Balak before it indicate that it's Torah and the observances, mitzvot, the commandments, that is going to become a document that is both utilized in religion and is going to be developed with commentaries and different types of commentaries. And through the history of Judaism, until this very day, commentaries are being written on the written Torah. Now, you'll hear proverbially that there are 613 commandments in Judaism contained in the Torah. Most of them are unobtainable by anybody living today. A significant number of the 613 are devoted to the sacrificing of animals, which ended when the temple was destroyed, in the second temple destroyed in the year 70 of this era by the Romans. There is no other offerings brought like were brought in the temple. So all of those commandments in the Torah of the 613 that deal with the officiations in this tabernacle and temple, and even though my synagogue was called Temple Bethel, it's the word synagogue, those things are not obtainable, cannot be observed. Then you have the commandments concerning the priests. All of those can't be observed because there are no officiating priests. There are people who say, I am a Kohen, I'm a descendant of the priesthood, but there's nothing there for them to practically do. There's a few symbolic things, but they're not even in the Torah. So all of the things connected to the priesthood are not observable. And so forth, that many of the commandments in the Torah are not the observable practices of Judaism. So how does this right-hand branch go? So for example, we read Torah, if you look to the left hand of the three branches at the bottom of that, we have the reading of the Torah every Shabbat, every Sabbath. We read it Sabbath morning, we read it Sabbath afternoon. It'll be read on holidays, and it'll be read on weekday mornings. Originally, with many Jews living in the Middle East, the language that they knew was not Hebrew at one juncture, certainly wasn't English. They knew Aramaic. And so the Targumim, the next one down in that left fork, is translations of the Torah into Aramaic. And to this very day, there are Jews from the country of Yemen, from the Arab Peninsula, that came to Israel, who, when they read Torah, their practice is to read one verse of the Torah in Hebrew, and someone off to the side reads the parallel verse in the Targum, in the Aramaic translation. And so you have the Targum. Now, it's also because when you translate, as you see from any language into another language, you have to select sometimes from multiple meanings. Therefore, the Targum is going to select a translation and freeze the translation of that word. Sometimes it tells us what did that word mean in a difficult word mean in older times. So the Targumim are a valuable part of the religious literature. It is not biblical, it's a translation of Bible. Similarly, through the ages, there are commentaries written on the Torah, and in a classical Hebrew edition of a Bible page, these commentaries are going to be around the margins of the book. Inside the middle of the book is going to be the text, and around them will be, in different type fonts, will be the commentaries. And the most famous of these commentaries are people called Rashi, Nachmanides, Ibn Ezra, and Rashbam. If I was making this page today, I'd have to make it a little bit differently and add continuing commentaries that are written even to this very day. And so the practice of Jewish religious literature, doing expository work on the text of the Torah, and the written Torah, it continues down through history. And if you stacked all these books one on top of the other and put a pin through them and choose your verse, you could see how different times and different places understand different parts of the text differently, as well as ask different questions. I use the biblical text in my sermons totally differently than anybody on this page over here, because I related the biblical text to the issues of the day. So that is one of the branches on the written Torah. I'm only doing the written Torah. Haven't gotten anyplace else yet. From the written Torah, I'm going to do the right hand of the fork on this page. On the right hand side, there is a tremendous amount in Torah of narrative as different from law. That narrative opens up a million questions and again, reflects time and place. So to give you an example, without giving you the answers to what it is, but just an example, in last week's Torah portion we read, Abraham takes Isaac for the quote, sacrifice of Isaac. He doesn't die, but leave that open for the moment. To Mount Moriah, and he binds him on the altar, following God's instructions. At the last moment, Abraham is told not to sacrifice Isaac. Going up the mountain, it says the two of them went together. Isaac asks Abraham, where's the animal to be sacrificed, etc. When it's over, Abraham returns to the boys he left down below. What happened to Isaac? Isaac isn't mentioned. So therefore, the midrash, the Agadic midrash, that is the exposition of the text from the narrative, takes up the question, what happened to Isaac? And why is the next thing in the Torah that Sarah dies, his mother dies? And so the midrash asks questions or finds questions in the text and tries to answer them. This created an immense amount of literature called the books of Agadic Midrashim, and also in terms of sermonizing, both in ancient times and current times, homiletics. My stuff would fall into the homiletics little corner over there on the right-hand side. This is a very, very large amount of literature, a great deal of it created from the years 200 to 700 of this era, CE. When you think, I mean, I have a second room that's only library, and I have just shelf after shelf of this literature because it is so immense. Now I'm going to go to the middle one, this one over here. There is law embedded in, or the sources of law embedded in the written Torah. So it says, for example, do not put a stumbling block before the blind. Well, obviously that can mean just don't put a rock in their way when they're walking down the sidewalk. I see many people around Temple Bethel here in Richmond, whether they're blind or they're learning how to work with blind people, so does it mean just don't put a stumbling block by the corner where they're going to cross over Grove Avenue? No. The Midrash will do an exposition on that verse on applying it to other legal situations. So don't sell something to somebody with an inherent defect in it that you don't tell them about. That's putting a stumbling block before the blind. The purchaser is blind to the internal workings, and you're hiding it from them. It could come under different things, but that's a simple exposition of how this works. So there is halachic midrashim, and these created, and we'll see on another page, again, an immense amount of literature that stands apart from what we're going to look on the left side of this page. Let me pause for a second, and Mary D, do you see any questions yet coming up?
I don't, and we did forget to tell people that if they have them, they can either wave or write it in the chat. But I don't see, but call for them, you could call for them now anyway.
I see 2 by the number chat, but I don't see anything else.
No, those are my notes to the class to tell them.
Okay, fair enough. Okay. So let me go back into my page over here, my little column that I'm working off at the middle of the right-hand side. At one point, some of the works on the left-hand side are going to get closed. We'll come to them in a little bit, but when they get closed, namely that form of literature ends, one of the really early forms of this literature, namely somewhere in the 900 CE to 1000 time, is called She'iltot. It's down under the Halachic Midrash, books of Halachic Midrashim, and then She'iltot. She'iltot comes from the word She'elah, meaning question. And what you have is a very early form of Q&A. And they would send them to recognized scholars, and the recognized scholars would then send the answers back to wherever it came. It's not quite putting the bottle in the ocean and waiting till somebody picks it up, but it was the way that they communicated, because the observance of Judaism, namely what does God want from us and how to do it, this is being created over time. And there's so many, how do you do this and how do you do that? And there are no books to go to per se. And therefore, they're sending in their questions. There was a question that came up. I missed it on the bottom. It went from 2 to 4. Are there 2 more things there, Mary Dean?
Is there a collection of commentary? Oops, do you all hear this echo? Sorry. Is there a collection of commentaries that would be the base commentaries that everyone uses or references? Are there contemporary ones that you would add to that list? And I'm thinking of the comparison to how Christians now reference the Revised Standard Version versus King James.
Okay.
New Revised Standard Version, right?
That question is a translation question, namely Revised Version vis-a-vis King James. Now you're talking about the translation text. And there are certain translations of the text that are more recognized, as well as some others that float around. The Jewish Publication Society in the early 1900s did a Jewish translation of the Holy Scriptures. That was what I was given when I was bar mitzvah, printing edition, God knows what. But they later, at the end of the 1900s, the end of the 20th century, issued a new translation for the called Tanakh, which is the Hebrew acronym for Bible. Those are the 2 most famous in terms of translations. In terms of commentaries, today people would go to the Reform movement issued a commentary to the 5 books of Moses, used in their synagogues, but obviously any place else. And the conservative movement also published recently, fairly recently, its own commentary to the 5 books of Moses as well, which we use in synagogue. The Jewish Publication Society issued a 5-volume set of commentary to the 5 books of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy. Those are today, if you're going from today, and certainly add them to the list, you can really divide the commentaries by classical time, and I'm going to have to move a little faster to get to the left-hand side of this page, to the list of commentaries. And the 4 of them listed there are the most common of the classical commentators, but they come, Rashi lived, the year 1100. He lived in France, all right? Nachmanides lived in Spain. Ibn Ezra lived in Spain. Rashbam, I forget where he lived. These people show, are reflecting from their time and place the questions. They're not going to have modern questions. So the commentaries are really reflective of their time and place. And yes, the list continues, and those are the standard ones. The Jewish Publication Society translations are the 2 most standard, the old one and the new one. And certainly by the movements today have issued their commentaries. And the Orthodox movement has their commentaries as well. This doesn't exhaust, but but mostly covers what happened to the written Torah and its exposition for the Judaism we live ever since the temple's been destroyed, in an ongoing process. Targumim early, reading of the Torah, etc. And the commentaries will develop over time. The exposition midrashically, both for law purposes and for narrative purposes, will continue over time. At one point, that type of literature is concluded, and the other literatures, homiletics, for example, will continue. Now I'm going to move to the left-hand side of this page. The book I got it from is listed on the very top here in my handwriting, so I didn't create it. For Judaism, alongside the written Torah, is what we call the oral Torah. And it is really within the oral Torah that the Judaism that we live today and have been living for 2,000 years, thereabouts, is really the Judaism that you haven't, anybody else has encountered. Because you cannot go to the temple without animal sacrifice and high priests and all the rest. That ended. And will be used as a model in terms of, A and A prime creating what we've created into the synagogue, which is again another lecture. But it is done through the medium of the oral Torah. And from the beginning, we posit there had to be an oral Torah alongside the written Torah, because the written Torah just didn't tell you how to do things. It says, observe the Sabbath. Well, how do I do that? We have a few examples, the wood chopper, etc., and going out to collect the manna on Saturday when they were told not to. But what else? Where do we get Sabbath candles? Where do I say the prayer over wine? Where do I get any of this Judaism that we observe? It's not in the written Torah. And in fact, the written Torah gives me several problems. If it says, do not burn a flame in your home on the Sabbath. Well, that might be good in the southern Negev of Israel or the Sinai Peninsula, but it's really not good in Jerusalem in the middle of the winter, nor in Richmond. So how do I observe the Sabbath if I can't burn a flame? My furnace burns a flame. No flame, no heat, no coffee. What do I do? So we posit that there had to be an oral tradition, which becomes called the oral Torah, alongside the written Torah. And oral means oral, namely that it was not written down, but was oral, which meant it was flexible. Meant things went in, it meant things went out, it meant things changed. It even had competing versions. So it was a fluid, up to a very late point, a fluid state. And in this fluid state, Judaism with a capital J, and I would like to put an S on the end of it, except it might confuse people, Judaisms were created. Because in certain ways, I referred to the Jews of Yemen before. There are Jews in India. There were Jews in Persia, ancient Iraq, Iraq, Iran, Iraq, where you'll see a lot of this gets created. Then comes North Africa as things shifted into Europe, into the United States, in Eastern Europe. You had different ways of doing things. Yes, there was maybe more a sense of collective, but there was many variations on the theme. So the oral tradition being flexible and fluid continued to develop. And we believed that it had to be an oral tradition in parallel to the time of the written Torah. But if we come down to the left-hand branch, the next box under the oral Torah is a box which is really very important. Where, and I'm going to preface it by saying, where is the authority for anything that comes except for from the written Torah? The written Torah, we can say God gave it to Moses, and that takes care of that question. But if on the other side, when we're making it up, when human beings, are creating the answers, all right, where does their authority come from? And the answer to that is called the Sinaitically delivered halacha. Halacha means law. Namely, that they posit that even if it wasn't written in the written Torah, 5 books of Moses, it was given to God by Moses without being in there, and that becomes the authorization for all that will continue further down. I have no proof. I have no document that says so. God didn't sign off on a contract, but it is the way Jewish tradition posited. So my Talmud class has been discussing something about whether when the temple stood, could priests have long hair when they officiated, and whether or not they could have a cup of wine before they officiated. one was said, this we learned as an oral tradition, and the other one was not mentioned in the oral tradition. It doesn't change the price of coffee today, but the point of the matter is for the illustration of things that are delivered from Sinai, even if they weren't in the written Torah. There is this continuation through the oral tradition that has its authorization in Sinai as it is being created. So if you ask me, how did Jews do something in the year 500 before the Common Era, except for referencing what went on in the rebuilt Second Temple, I have no idea. How did they keep the Sabbath? I don't know. How did they keep kosher? I don't know. We don't have any documents. We have no writings on these subjects. How did they do Passover? How did they build a sukkah? How tall, how short, how wide? Who knows? At one point in time, there will be collections of Jewish law that are created. One of the most famous ones was created by a rabbi called Rabbi Akiva in the 120s of the Common Era. We don't have this collection. Whatever happened to it, we don't know, but we know there was a collection, it was mentioned. But by the year 200 of the Common Era, a person called Rabbi Judah the Prince, because the Romans gave him authority, issued a collection called the Mishnah. And if you have page 3 of the documents I sent out to you, we sent out, you will see that he created a framework. And this framework has 6 sections. It's called the Orders and Tractates of the Mishnah, Tosefta, and Talmuds. I'll try to deal with all those words. And it's Zra'im, agricultural laws, Moed, holy occasions and festivals, Nashim, women, marriage law, Nezikin, right-hand side, damages and civil law, Kodashim, sacrifices, which gives us lots of the information of what was done in the temple. They saved this information. And Taharot, purification rituals. Again, some that are applicable and some that were really temple-based. Rabbi Judah the Prince in the year 200 of the Common Era published, not by written form yet, but proclaimed in oral form, this structure you see on page 3, collecting the oral traditions that go way back to Sinai, that were never written down, and organizing them in this manner. And this becomes the cornerstone for the creation of Judaism. It was already being created, but we have a document that gives us what it is in an early form. And there are going to be underneath the block missions as commentators, and those commentators range over many, centuries. You have older commentators, newer commentators, etc. So we have, but here is where you're going to see, especially in the first section called benedictions, and then in the holy occasion section, and then in marriage and divorce in terms of the third section, you will see how the Judaism that if you come to a synagogue, where did this all come from? Right? How do Jews do certain things today? How is a Jewish wedding, a Jewish marriage, etc.? What documents do we use, etc.? This is already embedded here, which we never had before the year 200 in terms of a document. Again, let me pause for a second. Is there anybody raising questions, or am I just floating on?
I don't see anybody.
Okay, then let's go forward. Okay. Drake, was Drake raising his hand? Can't tell. Okay.
Rabbi Creditor,
Yes.
let me ask you a question. Are the Dead Sea Scrolls affecting interpretation of some Jewish teachings? And how might this work to amend the oral or written tradition?
The Dead Sea Scrolls will give us insight into what we have. Whether it affected its creation, we leave up to the scholars to keep fighting out that battle. But it gives us an insight into an alternate Judaism that didn't make it. Okay. What went on went on in their habitation in Qumran did not affect the creation, the mainstream creation between the Sadducees, Pharisees, and the rabbis going forward. Somebody's question came up, I missed it. Or was it a comment?
So all Jewish denominations use the orders and tractates in the same manner? Question mark.
No, it's not that they use it or don't use it. The question is that the Judaism that's being developed over time is founded on it. The movements are going to be a whole nother discourse for 2 different lectures. I can't do it that, can't go into it that way. But this is the foundation for the Judaism that'll come up into the 1800s when the Reform movement is born. So do we use it? It's not that they use it. They created a Judaism that comes out from here, and however they wanted to differ. Orthodoxy will continue a more traditional Judaism, and conservative is going to try to conserve the best of tradition and integrate with modernity as we go through time. But this is the foundation for the development of Judaism for the next 1,600 years. I think that's the best.
Let me ask one more. The Catholics have a pope. Did the Jews ever have a central leader like a pope at any time?
No, both for the good and for the bad. All right. All of this is still oral, is still fluid. Let me move on to the next. Let me amplify my answer through the next block. The Talmud, which is the next stage down. So the Mishnah, we normally say the Mishnah material really is a 400-year block of time and material, somewhere from 200 or so before the Common Era to 200 of the Common Era, when Judah the Prince has the political authority to issue this oral document. And then that closes that document. When Judah the Prince created this document, okay, in terms of its major components, that's done. But from 200 to 500 or so, there will be the ongoing exposition of the Mishnah level material, and it's going to be done in the land of Israel, not in Jerusalem, but in the land of Israel, and that's going to be called the Jerusalem Talmud by rabbis in the land of Israel. They will wind up, because of persecutions, they're going to wind up mostly in the northern Galilee and in the city of Tiberias. And in parallel time will be the Jews in Babylonia with separate centers, separate main schools called yeshivot, and leaders of it. And they're going to do the exposition there in parallel time based on the same Mishnah. They're going to develop it in 2 different places. There will also be people who go back and forth between Babylonia and the land of Israel, bringing traditions. So sometimes you're reading in the Talmud, you're studying, and all of a sudden it says that Rabbi so-and-so said, but he wasn't in Babylonia, he was in Israel, and somebody brought his teaching, and I'll get to the editors in a moment. So you have 2 different Talmuds. The one that will be the main force will be the Babylonian Talmud, because the land of Israel will, under persecutions, will close up shop earlier. The Babylonian community was larger and was able to stay in physical existence longer. That reflects, the histories of the places, and again, beyond the scope for the moment. Watching myself. There are many differences between the 2 Talmuds. First of all, which are the rabbis in each of them. Second of all, how they handle the subject matter. Thirdly, because the Jerusalem Talmud is in Western Aramaic, which I don't know, and the Babylonian Talmud is an Eastern Aramaic on which I break my teeth. And so you have, and the Babylonian Talmud had a longer lifespan in creation, and therefore had a great deal of editorship, which the Jerusalem Talmud did not have. Today, much modern scholarship is looking at the influence that Jerusalem Talmud had much more than it was given credit for or acknowledged. So therefore, that's where modern scholarship is really looking at the internal workings of these documents. Now, the Babylonian Talmud is really this whole page. And it goes on for quite a long time. We say that the document is closed around the year 500. That meant no new material was put in, but then there's going to be, for 200 years or more, editorship. Just imagine that everybody has their class notes, from a couple hundred years of going to school and what their teacher said. And these group of people are going to winnow the chaff out of all of those class notes and create a dialogue of material between generations and places. So if you have 3 or 4 or 5 different rabbinical schools, doesn't matter, they're all talking about something, or I can say they pulled it together and they can create this conversation, which becomes the Talmud. And this is being done from all this material and will be done through the year 800 or so of the Common Era. I wish I could have been a fly on the wall through time to see this happening, but all I have is a document, and they didn't tell us how they did it, but now people are going back through different tools to go back and figure all this out. I've just read some of it and I find it to be illuminating, but I can't do more than that. While you're holding these pages in front of you, if you will look at page 4 and 4 and on to 5, I'm going to try now in the next 5 minutes or so, I think that's when I have to end, is to do the rest of this column. The Babylonian Talmud doesn't give me many answers. It gives me tons of material, tons of conversation. But if you ask me out of the Babylonian Talmud, how do you do something? I say, I don't have the foggiest notion. How did this get developed? And that is going to be through different volumes over time that are collecting in their own internal organization the laws, the traditions, and codifying them. Okay? That codifying is the process of now structuring Judaism for the Jewish people that are stretched over the globe, whether the Jews in India, the Middle East, the Arabian Peninsula, across North Africa, Turkey, the Balkans, Italy, Spain, into Europe, England, eventually to come here. How do you do what you do, and how do you kind of shape a common ground between Jews that are so spread out? And so these are the groups. Yes, Mary Dean.
I've got a question asking if page 3 is the Babylonian Talmud.
It's the same structure for both Talmuds. Now, not every line here has the second material from 200 to 5, but they all are based on the same material of Judah the Prince, the year 200. That level material is all there. If you look on page 4, in the very top, this is by my class notes, by the way, when I was in college. It's a typewriter page. He divided the Mishnah into the 6 sections that are all on the page 3, but here they are just listed out like that. And the rabbis of the Mishnah have a title to them, and there's material that's not included from this time period in another collection called the Tosefta. The Gemara is the discussions in the Mishnah material 200 to 500, Babylonian Jerusalem. And so you can have a formula that the Mishnah plus the Babylonian Gemara is that one, and the Jerusalem Talmud is the Mishnah plus what they did in the land of Israel. The rabbis of the Gemara are called Amoraim. The Babylonian Talmud only deals with 37 of the 63 sections of the Mishnah. Page 3 is 63. You can count them, but it is what it is. But there's only 37 of them have development. And in the Jerusalem Talmud, there's a different number. Now, to go back and let me try to get to this, because whatever we don't do today, we'll start with that on next Sunday. The compilations and codifications is what is going to give Judaism its structure and propagation to the Jews throughout the world, so they know what's what. The first group, which I don't have on my other page, is called Halachot Gedolot. There's other smaller, earlier compilations. The Alfasi is my number 4 on page 4. Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi from Algeria, in Fez, a condensation of the Talmud. Okay, only laws pertaining to his time frame. And then following that, the next collection is going to be what Maimonides did, which is my number 5, called the Mishnah Torah Yad Chazakah. He sets up his own structure, and it's in classical Hebrew. It's great to read and great exposition. And then comes the turning point in Jewish literature, religious literature, called the Four Turim, which is on page 5, which is page 5 is number 7, and that becomes by Rabbi Yaakov, the son of Asher. Number 6 is the father, number 7 is the son, and he creates 4 sections, 4 major pillars, and that is what's under E: Orach Chaim, Yoredeya, Even Ha'ezer, Choshen Mishpat, laws of daily life, prohibition and permission, personal laws and civil laws. He takes all of Jewish tradition from the Talmud, and from then to his time, and he's living 1240, the end of the 13th century, and he organizes them into 4 main sections. Thanks God, because otherwise I couldn't find anything. It'd be impossible. I have books I bought just because they have indexes, not because I needed the book itself, because I have the same material, but I wouldn't know how to find it. So the index gives me the ability to find find what I'm looking for. He creates this, and then on his page, there are the commentaries around the page. So when you're studying and you want to ask me a question and you want me to give the answer through time, I've got to look at I got to go all the way back to Bible. I got to go back to the book, beginning of this page, and I got to track it. Where did it go? And who said what to whom and how? And if it's for practical stuff, I got to come down this chain on the left. Mary D?
We have one more question. We're just about at time, but we've got this one. Are there ever commentaries that are rejected or determined to be heretical?
Rejected, yes. Heretical, no. That word doesn't really show up in this material. But the commentaries will argue. And what happens, how do you know whether it was rejected or not, is because what happened in the next time gap? That's what happened? Were they accepted or were they rejected? Now, if they were rejected in one place, they could be accepted in the other. So do I face this way now and that way then? Well, they say yes and they say no or whatever. But the point of the matter is that over time, you will see what becomes the accepted manner. I'm going to pause because this is a good place to pause for the moment with the Four Turim, and I'll come back and then I'll go down that column and then go to the other and then get to some of the other material for next Sunday.
Well, we're at time now, actually.
Then I'll pause with this and we'll pick up from that sentence next Sunday. And if people have questions, they can submit them to you.
Yeah, if people have questions, they can send them to Drake. Email them to Drake and we'll get them to you ahead of time.
Sure. It's hard to condense this into the short time.
This has been very interesting, Rabbi, and you'll be focusing on what pages next week.
I'm going to finish off the column on page 1, and then
Okay.
and then try to get into some of the examples starting from page 6 and on to through there.
Okay.
I'll make
So
my best
finish
run
up.
at it.
There you go. Okay. Well, that sounds good. Listen, this has been very informative and interesting. And like Mary D said, if you have any questions, please feel free to email them to me and we'll get them to Rabbi Creditor and he can address them next week. And hope Rabbi, thanks again for today. We look forward to having you back next week
Look forward
once
to it.
again. And hope everybody has a safe and healthy week. And we'll see you next Sunday.
Very
Please
good.
remember to tune in for online services at 10 o'clock in just a few minutes. So
Okay.
thanks, everyone.
Have a good week.
You too.
Bye-bye.